I'm Mike Thompson. I'm a Director of Solutions at the PCI Council. And today we're going to be talking about phishing, about passwords, a little bit about DSS. So it's great to be here, and I hope you find this session useful. And I'll give you an advance notice. We're going to have a QR code at the end. So if you do have your phones at the ready at the end, and you'll also be using your phones just slightly after that as well. So, show of hands, how many in the room has heard of the FIDO Alliance? Just a few. This is going to be great. This is going to be great. How many then have heard of passkeys? More. Okay, good. That is a pretty good turnout. So I'm going to give you a little bit of foreshadowing. By the end of today's session, all the hands are going to be up. Right. So you can't fail, basically, is what I'm saying. And hopefully all hands would go up if we asked, do you know what phishing is? And none of us like phishing, and we're not talking the recreational sport, right? This is where those unfortunate malicious actors are trying to trick us in order to get our sensitive information, whether that be credit card data, passwords, or other things that they can use, and in today's context, to compromise accounts. So, FIDO Alliance, most salient aspect I think here, it's an open organization. And the mission statement, right, nice and bold there, reduce the world's reliance on passwords. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So, how do they aim to fulfill that mission? First part is technical specifications. So if you were to go out, and again, we're going to have a link at the end, I'm foreshadowing, out to the FIDOalliance.org website, you would find a lot of useful information, and you would see those technical specifications around user authentication, device onboarding, around credential exchange. So they have links there to those technical specifications, in addition to industry certification programs, and the always important aspect of programs around market adoption, right? Being able to get the word out, promote the use of FIDO globally, driving that education to help people understand, which in part is why I'm here today, to help spread that message. So in the real world, when you meet people face to face, just us here, so much easier to authenticate someone. All the cues that we have, we can see them, we can talk to them, we can hear them. All these parameters when we meet people in real life. However, as we know, on the internet, you don't necessarily know who's on the other end, who you're speaking to. It becomes much more difficult to authenticate either other people or to authenticate yourself. This is a screen we're all familiar with. We want to authenticate ourselves, usually to some particular online service, an online account. Enter your username, enter your password. This is quite ubiquitous. We're all familiar with this. With that said, however, this is still highly susceptible to attacks, highly susceptible to phishing. So there's two statistics on here I want to highlight. Top left, 81% of hacking-related breaches caused by weak passwords or stolen passwords. And if we combine that with the bottom right, 64%, and unfortunately probably no one in this room, but 64% of people either use weak passwords or they'll do a slight variation of a password, right? Add a 1 on the end, a 2 on the end, etc. And so when you take these statistics in aggregate, it's not a good picture. Then it gets even worse. Now with AI and generative AI, everything's going through the roof. And I wouldn't blame anybody if you looked at these numbers and thought we missed a decimal point. This is how significant the phishing attacks are getting and how at risk we all are to these types of attacks. So just a quick refresher, we're all experts in the room, but we talk about multi-factor authentication, and it's generally something we have like a fob, a token, a card. Something we are, biometrics, right? Fingerprints, facial scan, voice, and something we know, like a PIN or password. However, passwords, even one-time passwords, are still susceptible to phishing. So it's not good enough all the time. And let's walk through some examples. So definitely the worst case would be there's no password required, but we're not going to start there. But non-complex passwords, highly susceptible to all these range of attacks, right? This is something where your password is the name of your dog, right? To get into a site, the name of the street that you live on. We can increase that if we bump that up to a complex password. That reduces that risk profile just a bit. However, and again, none of us in this room, a lot of people, even if they create a complex password, will reuse that password for multiple accounts that they have, making it susceptible to phishing as well. If we take that up a notch, we can still leverage the complex password, but make it unique. So we're using a unique complex password per account, but as any of us know, most people have a significant number of accounts. It becomes very difficult to manage. This is where we see the introduction of password managers to help with that. But even then, it kind of becomes a logistical nightmare at times, or so it seems. So we can take that unique complex password, combine that with a one-time password. However, that is still susceptible to phishing. And ultimately, where we'd want to get to is to phishing-resistant authentication mechanisms or protocols. And for today's session, that's where FIDO comes in and FIDO protocols. So going back to the question we asked initially, so for all those that did not raise their hand, this is the slide where you'll raise your hand at the end. What's a passkey? And essentially, it's a mechanism, it's based on FIDO protocols, to replace that password. So how does that work? Well, public key cryptography. Private key, public key, you take that key pair, most of us are quite familiar with that, that becomes the passkey. That private key bound to the device, that public key registered, bound to that online domain, that online service, and again, they kind of were registered together uniquely to identify that user to that domain. What does that look like? You generally are going to use, on the device, the mechanisms we're all familiar with. You enter some type of hand gesture, a PIN code, a particular pattern, maybe it's biometrics. So that's going to allow that user on that device their access. We're generally familiar with that. Most of us, if not absolutely all of us, have mobile phones, for example. That's going to enable that passkey mechanism. Then, given that public key cryptography, and it's great at this, there will be a challenge response mechanism that's engaged that then will be used to authenticate that user to that particular service. In addition, there's the ability to securely sync that private key across devices, and most of us have more than one device. There's also the ability for cross-device authentication. So based on proximity, using low-energy Bluetooth, BLE, there's that capability to do syncing across devices as well. So at this point, you might be asking, what's the availability look like? These are the platforms it's available on, so this is what I would regard, and most of us regard, this is a high degree of availability across a plethora of platforms. So just looking at some of the numbers, and this is extremely promising, 96% active browsers, 98% mobile devices, 13 billion on accounts, and 20% across the top 100 and 12% across the top 250 websites and services. And this is just since, as you note on the slide here, October 2022. So very promising numbers. And always great to exemplify use case studies. And these are likely some highly recognizable names on the screen. And we see statistics that not only related to security, but really the user experience as well. Quicker sign-ins, greater success rates for logging in, more expedient authentication that's happening. So very promising with well-known companies adopting the use of passkeys. So what would a session be without a little standards-based information? If we're looking at PCI DSS, requirement 841 requires MFA for that non-console access into the CDE for personnel with administrative access. Now, even with phishing-resistant authentication mechanism, it still does require an additional authentication factor. That's given that criticality of that administrative access. That's why it's underscored there. But there's also requirement 842. And the guidance you see here is in the DSS, right? And essentially, if phishing-resistant authentication is used, this requirement does not apply. And I will note, and again, this is in the standard, this is a best practice up until the end of March 2025, but after that, this will become a required requirement after that date. But that's something to be mindful of. So there's mechanisms to reduce a bit on the requirement you have to meet here, depending on the authentication mechanism that gets implemented. I won't read all of this, but if you want more information about console access, you can go out to the FAQs on the PCI SSC website, and that's requirement 1577. So if you just type that in, that will bring up this definition and context. You can read more about console access, just give you information. And I just do want to point out, it's not a requirement within the DSS that the factors are authenticated prior to the indication of success of any one factor. So it's a little technical caveat for people to be aware of there. So what are the recommendations? This is the takeaway. So 12-character password requirements are coming. Again, this is another requirement that is a best practice through the end of March, and then as of April 2025 will become required. We talked about that MFA requirement, also a best practice at 842, and then as of April will become required. And ideally, hopefully, even just this session, there's that motivation. Let's try to get to that phishing-resistant authentication mechanisms. We saw those alarming statistics. So hopefully we're leaving here with a healthy dose of awareness and knowing that we need to improve these mechanisms so that we can increase that risk posture. And it's not just about the credentials either, right? It's the enrollment process and everything around it and the reset and the tokens, all of that. We want to make sure that the end-to-end of that authentication is secure. And lastly, anytime we're talking about cryptography, DSS 1233 should always be kept in mind. So I'm going to give folks a moment to take out your phones. You will want your phones after this, just shortly after this. And so I'll give you a second to scan that QR code, or you can go out to the FIDO Alliance website. There's some great information out there. They have great links. But while we're doing that, and you already have your phones held up anyway, everyone raise your hands if you've heard of the FIDO Alliance. Everyone's hands got to go up. Everyone raise your hand if you've heard of passkeys. Excellent. I'm going to call it 100% just because I know people are scanning those QR codes. And with that, I'd just like to say thank you. I hope you now have more information about the FIDO Alliance, about passkeys, probably information you don't want about phishing, given the alarming statistics, and appreciate it and hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.